Well, let me start off with a story. It was a 7-year-old Swedish boy playing happily with his two brothers in their hotel room. They were on holiday in Thailand, and the sun was shining brightly, the weather was beautiful, and little Carl was having the time of his life. His parents were lounging by the pool, enjoying themselves, and Carl and his little brothers, they were playing with their Christmas presents they'd opened the day before. This for them was a Christmas vacation, a vacation in paradise. But this was the year 2005. 1 minute, Carl was surrounded by family and happiness and smiles. The next minute, he was underwater, surrounded by churning broken glass, bits of wood, dirt, sand, the lot. Carl, along with his two brothers, was quickly swept out of his hotel room, but he managed to grab onto a passing advertising board and he held on for dear life. And when the mega tsunami of 2005 finally washed itself out, Carl found himself in a completely different city, surrounded by destruction and dead bodies. And he was completely and utterly alone. His father, gone. His mother, gone. His two siblings, gone. All of them had been swept away to their death. Now, little Carl Nielsen that day was forsaken. He found himself abandoned, without hope, without security, covered in mess and blood, in terrible pain from his injuries, and everything he loved about life was stripped away forever. And his pitiful cries of "Mummy, where are you?" and "Daddy, help me," those cries were met with nothing but silence. That's the gravity of the word forsaken. That's what it means to be abandoned. So this morning, as we look at this famous event, as we look at the King Jesus on the cross, we're going to ask ourselves, why was Jesus forsaken by God? Why was Jesus forsaken by his own Father? So we've got 3 points and one big question at the end. Point number 1, Jesus is forsaken by people. So let's remind ourselves of what Jesus has been through up until the point he's been crucified. Remember, he'd been betrayed by one of the 12, one of his inner circle, Judas Iscariot, who after supper goes and reports to the chief priests, and he leads a mob of soldiers right to Jesus' location. And when Jesus doesn't put up a fight, he's then forsaken by the rest of the 12. His friends, his students. He'd spent the last 3 years training them as their rabbi, and yet they abandoned him. And then we saw how he was denied by the best of the 12. Peter, the strongest, the toughest, the bravest disciple, disowned his friends. Peter is outfoxed by a teenage girl and a chicken, isn't he? And then last week, we saw how the king was rejected by his own people. First up, the political elite reject him. He was bounced through a kangaroo court in the early hours of the morning, and the religious leaders charged him with blasphemy, and then he was savagely beaten. And then later at his public trial, his fellow countrymen, who'd been waving palm branches 5 days earlier as he'd entered Jerusalem, they honoured him as their king. Well, now they scream for his execution. Crucify him, they demand. And now their demands are met. So finally, Jesus is handed over to the Roman soldiers. They flog him, they mock him. And look again at verse 20. When they'd mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him and they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Jesus is so tired, so worn out at this point. As he makes his way to Calvary, he keeps falling over. He hasn't got the strength to carry this crossbeam. But actually, verse 21 gives us a little glimpse of what life was like for the average Jew in the first century. A Roman soldier says to a bystander, a man called Simon, "Oi, you help this guy carry this thing. Help him carry this cross." Now imagine if a policeman told us to do something like that today. "Here, mate, can you, if I order you, carry this criminal's bag, his handcuffs are too tight for him." What would you say? "Jog on, mate, I'm not doing that. You don't have the right to tell me to do that. I'm not helping this criminal. I'm not going to be walking behind this bloke. People will think I'm with him." It's humiliating, isn't it? But Simon's got no choice. If he refuses, he'll get a clip round the ear, or worse, thrown into prison himself. Saying no to this is not even an option for him. And so this stranger, Simon, has to pick up the cross and help Jesus carry it. But notice something from the text, something quite obvious. Ask yourself, how does Mark end up knowing who Simon's sons are? It says, Simon of Cyrene, so Cyrene's in North Africa, it's Libya, the father of Alexander and Rufus. How does Mark know who his boys are? Well, it's because Simon must have been converted, mustn't he? Simon must become part of the church. And therefore, the early church fathers know him and they know his sons. So this is an eyewitness testimony. Mark has got this from Simon. Whatever Simon saw happen that weekend changes his life forever. Verse 22, they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. Now, scholars aren't 100% sure why this place is called Golgotha. Is it because there's a rock there, a cave that looks like a human skull? Or is it simply because this is a place where so many people are executed? We're not sure. But nevertheless, verse 23, they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. They crucified him and divided his garments amongst them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. Now, don't overlook the significance of verse 24. In artwork depicting the crucifixion, Jesus is usually always portrayed as wearing a little loincloth, isn't he? The loincloth will cover his modesty. But in reality, people didn't wear underpants in the first century. And fabric was incredibly expensive. Even old bits of fabric, you'd use them as rags, you'd use them for something else. What you wouldn't do, under any circumstances, is waste fabric on a slave who's about to be executed. And so here's the horror, here's the humiliation of the cross. Jesus is stripped naked. So imagine that for a second. Imagine the shame that would have placed on him. He is publicly exposed, publicly mocked. And in that naked state, they take his arms and they drive nails through his wrists, pinning him to a cross. And then they do the same with his feet. And at 9 a.m., verse 25, as the sun begins to climb in the eastern sky, they pull that cross upright and then shove it into a hole in the grounds. And the Son of God is raised from the earth. Second point, Jesus is mocked by people. What's Jesus' crime? Why is he on that cross? Well, it's right here in verse 26. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And what do the Romans and the Jewish leaders think of their king? Well, they say this guy's no better than a worthless criminal. Verse 27, with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right, one on his left. So this is part of his humiliation, isn't it? This is how they degrade him. He's despised like one of these criminal underclass. He's no better than this. Now, in the ESV Bible, they've omitted verse 28 because it's only found in later manuscripts, but it's still nevertheless true. So this is what verse 28 says. He's numbered, he's with these robbers to fulfill scripture. Isaiah 53, where it says he was numbered with the transgressors. Verse 29, those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. Now, if you've been following along on Sunday mornings, you'll know that when Jesus is killed, it's the start of the Passover festival. And Jerusalem is packed with Jewish pilgrims from all over the Roman Empire. That's why Simon of Cyrene is there, right? Maybe he lived in North Africa and he's made his trip all the way to Jerusalem. And so it is Ramo. And as each of these pilgrims walks into Jerusalem, there they see their king. They've got to walk past him in order to get into the city. Same way you've got to walk past Lewisham Clock Tower to get into Lewisham, right? So here's this man whose crime is being the king of the Jews. And he's pinned to a cross. And the visitors to Jerusalem are sickened by the sight of him. They shake their heads in disgust. No doubt many of these people, they'd heard rumours about Jesus. His name had spread throughout the whole country. Maybe it had even gone further afield. And maybe some of them had high hopes when they heard about this potential Messiah. But now as they walk in on that Passover weekend, their hopes are dashed. And so they turn their frustration on him. If this guy was the Messiah, if he is God's special king, then do a miracle, mate. Come on. Save yourself. Come down from the cross, they bark, and save us as well. We're under Roman oppression. We could do with a saviour. And then the religious leaders mock him in the same way. Verse 31, the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Well, this is laughable, isn't it? These people had seen Jesus do some truly remarkable things. Miracle after miracle. And yet they're never satisfied. They don't want signs of love and mercy and restoration. No, they demand a show of strength. They see their king as nothing more than a loser, a weak loser, who won't do anything for them. And even the two criminals, the thieves next to him, they get in on the act. Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. So do you see, every level of society, from the religious elite to the Roman soldiers to the worthless criminals slowly dying next to him, they all mock Jesus. They push him and they stamp on him until he's at the very bottom of the pile. They pity him. They mock him. They cannot stand the sight of him. In their eyes, this guy is nothing but a joke, a man to be laughed at. And this carried on for 3 agonizing hours. But actually, the whole tone of this event changes in verse 33. Look what it says. When the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. As Jesus dies on the cross, something truly terrifying begins to happen. The 6th hour is midday, 12 noon, when the Middle Eastern sun is at its highest and at its hottest. But suddenly, the sun seems to fade out. It becomes overcast. Thick clouds cover the land. Jerusalem is plunged into eerie darkness. Now, I'll admit here and now, I'm still a bit scared of the dark. In the winter, I'll be working in my office. It will get to 5 or 6 when I finish, and I'll suddenly remember, oh yeah, I've got to lock this place up. So I'll make my way through the church in the near darkness. Hudson Hall's usually all right because there's some skylights in there and they let the street light through. But then I'll get into the lobby or the vestibule, and it's there. I've got to turn all the lights off. And there'll be a few seconds where all the lights are off and it's dark. I'm trying to get out the door and there's a dread. The childlike part of my brain begins to convince me there's something lurking behind me. Even though I've just been through the building and I've checked it, and I know there's nothing back there, part of me says, you need to be wary of the dark. In short, human beings are scared of the dark. I distrust anyone who says they ain't, right? So imagine what the people standing by the cross must have thought. Maybe I thought, oh, this is strange. I don't remember rain being forecast. But the clouds become thick and heavy. And then this isn't just a natural phenomenon. Don't think this was just a really overcast day in London. It's not. There is a supernatural darkness that takes over. A darkness, maybe a fog, we're not sure, that covers the whole of Mount Zion and the temple. And it cascades into Jerusalem. It spills over the walls. It seeps into Calvary. And a foreboding sense of fear grips everyone standing by because it's getting darker. And suddenly the insults stop and the cussing ceases. And now you can barely make out the King of the Jews. And the chief priest's mocking laughter turns into a nervous laughter. And they're filled with dreads. And one by one, maybe they make their excuses and fade away. I wonder if in the pit of their stomachs, they began to get nervous. Did they begin to question what they'd done? Because this is unlike any other crucifixion they've ever witnessed. And as the darkness got deeper, they got more and more terrified. Third point, Jesus is forsaken by God. For 3 hours, the thick darkness blocks out the afternoon sun, and a hushed silence, a fear grips everyone. Verse 34, at the 9th hour, that's 3 p.m., Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? This cry explains the darkness that's just occurred. The Apostle John tells us, doesn't he, that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. But what happens when a person is thrown out of God's presence? What happens when God abandons you? Well, it's this. You're plunged into total darkness. See, from the hours of 9 to 12, it had been people who had screwed up their faces in disgust. They looked at Jesus and thought, that is disgusting. I don't want any of that. And they turned away from the mess and the blood and the horror of the cross. But far worse happens at midday. Between midday and 3, as the darkness closes in, it's now God the Father who can't look at Jesus. It's God the Father who is sickened by the sight of his only begotten Son. And Jesus cries out the words of King David from Psalm 22. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? Why have you removed your presence from me and your care and your compassion? Where is it? But now, when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's met with silence. Remember when he was baptized, God said, this is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased, but now there's nothing from heaven. Charles Spurgeon says this about this comment of Jesus. He says, did not Jesus know? Did he not know why he was forsaken? He knew it most distinctly, and yet his humanity, while it was being crushed, pounded and dissolved, seemed as though it could not understand the reason for so great a grief. I tremble lest I say what I ought not to say. I have said it, and I think there is truth. The man of sorrows was overcome with horror. Jesus is horrified on the cross. Why was Jesus horrified? Well, here's the chilling truth. It's because God cast his son into hell. For 3 hours, the Son of God became our sin. Every shameful thought, every nasty word and deed we've ever committed was placed on the shoulders of Jesus. And our sin carries the death penalty, doesn't it? It's a spiritual separation order for anyone who breaks God's rules and laws. That's why Jesus was forsaken. He's thrown into the darkness to pay for our sin. Hanging on a cross, he pays our debt. He's tortured both physically and spiritually, forsaken for us, forsaken because we deserve to be forsaken. Now look, there's no way we can get our heads around what occurred on the cross. It's beyond us. God the Father turns his back on God the Son. But I do think it's important to say this. On the cross, Jesus never stops for 1 second being God. Even during these 3 hours of chronic misery, when the Father sends his full wrath on the Son, Jesus is as much God as he ever is and has ever been. In other words, on the cross, the Trinity is still intact. Jesus doesn't take 3 hours off and say, well, I'm not God anymore. He's still very much God. And that's perplexing, isn't it? We can't understand that. It's said that Martin Luther, there's a photo of Martin Luther, he once sat down to write a sermon on this passage, and he sat at his desk chewing on the meaning of these words for quite some time. So he's in there, and he's just thinking about this. How can God punish God and Jesus still be God? Every once in a while, someone would knock on the door open and say, are you all right, Martin? And he'd say, yeah. And he was there for hours. Hours passed, and he still hadn't written a word. And finally, they say Luther threw his arms up in the air and he exclaimed, God, forsaken by God, who can understand it? Well, that's what we're confronted with on the cross. Someone we can't fully, as human beings, comprehend. We don't understand it, but it is crucial that we believe it. Look what happens with Jesus' final cry in verse 37. Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, Mark here, as is his style when he writes, he does a cut scene, and he takes us to the temple a few hundred yards from where Jesus is being crucified. Now, here is a video of what the temple kind of looked like in Jesus' day. And we're going to go into the main part, through the main doors of the temple, a section that only the priests could visit. This part was known as the most holy place. And you'll see that in the first century, they'd erected two curtains. The first curtain is covered with the faces of angels we read about in Ezekiel 1. But this first curtain is unnecessary. The law of Moses never said to put a second curtain in. So the Jews that introduced it, they were kind of hedging their bets, putting an extra safe barrier between them and God. Behind that extra curtain, though, you saw another curtain. It was purple and red and blue. This main curtain was established by Yahweh in the law that he'd given to Moses. And this curtain separated the two zones. It separated the most holy place to something called the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies was a place of supreme holiness, the most special place in all the earth. Notice there's a little space in the Holy of Holies. What used to go there? The Ark of the Covenant, right? God's footstool, this beautiful gold box with angels on it. And it was on the Ark of the Covenant that God rested his feet. That's where God the Father touched the earth, where God would dwell with human beings. Right there in the temple in Jerusalem. But let's think about Bible history. That relationship between God and human beings, it was established in Genesis, but what had happened to it in Genesis? Not a trick question. Lara, you look like you want to answer. It was broken, right? Because of man's sin. Adam and Eve are thrown out of the garden, banished. There's a separation between God and man. And that's why we had this curtain. We've got a barrier placed between presence with God and human beings. In fact, there were angels woven in to that purple curtain. It's a reminder of Eden. They're symbols telling us that for us to pass into God's presence means death. But when Jesus gives up his life, Mark tells us that curtain is torn in two. From top to bottom, the barrier comes down. In other words, God tells his angels to stand down. We see that in films, don't we? So there'll be a general and they'll say, "Stand down, men," and then all the guns will get lowered. Well, now, God tells the angels to stand down. Men and women can walk back into God's presence. And we can do that because Jesus has paid our debt. And we're made holy through his sacrifice. Why was Jesus forsaken? Well, here's the answer in verse 28. So that you and I can have access to a holy God. So that anyone who puts their faith in him can walk back into the Lord's presence. Okay, we've had 3 points then. Let's end with one important question. And it's a question of how will you respond to what we've heard this morning? As Jesus is crucified, Mark presents us with 2 different human reactions. Did you see that? There are 2 loud shouts in verse 34 and 37, followed by 2 responses. When Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Look how some of the people react. Verse 35, some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Behold, he's calling Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down." Think about these bystanders. They've just experienced a supernatural darkness. They've heard Jesus crying out the prophetic words of Psalm 22. But they still don't understand what's going on. They do not join the dots. Even at this point, they're still looking for a miracle, aren't they? A sign from heaven. And of course, the irony is they're ignoring the sign from heaven right in front of their eyes. Their response, even at this stage, is to look somewhere else for salvation. So they say, it sounds like he's calling for Elijah. Perhaps Elijah will now pop down from heaven, save him, and save us as well. Well, look, friends, are you still looking elsewhere for the source of your salvation? Some people come to church and they think they can wash away their sin simply by trying hard enough. Maybe you think you can wash away your sins simply by coming to church enough. Church attendance is kind of what gets you into heaven. God's happy with you. You rocked up, put a bit of money in the collection. Well done. Perhaps you think your good deeds will outweigh your bad, and that will make you okay. Well, look, understand this morning, nothing but the unique death of Jesus Christ has the power to save you. That's the only thing we can rely on. We have no power in ourselves. It's his death on the cross that we must put our faith and hope and trust in. And that's what convinces the Roman centurion. This is the second response. Look at verse 37. Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And verse 39, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Now, this centurion would have been well acquainted with death. Over his career, he would have been involved in dozens and dozens of crucifixions. But in all that time, he had never seen anything like this. A man whose death changes the weather. A man whose torture darkens the sun and causes the ground to shake, we're told elsewhere. And this man doesn't die gasping for breath. He doesn't whimper out. He doesn't fade out over a couple of days. No, this man on the cross chooses the exact moment of his death. He cries out with a loud voice. That means that Jesus is in total control of when he dies. John's Gospel, chapter 10, records Jesus saying this: "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up." This unique death that the Roman centurion sees, it stuns him. Hours earlier, he'd been mocking Christ, striking him, spitting on him, bowing sarcastically down to him. But now he's moved by his death, moved by the death of the king. It shakes him up, it changes him. In all that carnage, he sees the glory of God and he acknowledges who Jesus is. Well, friends, as we've looked at the King's Cross this morning, there's only two reactions. One, you can ignore it. You think it's a nice story, it's a bit religious story, but I'm going to look elsewhere for my salvation. I'm going to find another way to have a relationship with God. Or two, you can follow the path of the centurion who recognized that Jesus' death on the cross was history-shattering and life-changing. But the question this morning is, will his death and resurrection alter your story? Will it change your life and your eternity?